Welcome to Let's Talk About Conflict with your host, Lynne Nash.
Hello, and welcome back to Let's Talk About Conflict. I'm your host, Lynne Nash, and today's conversation is something completely different. Today, we are going to talk with John Marks. He is the author of From Vision to Action. I am holding a book up for those listening to this while you're on a treadmill. If you're watching it, you saw the book cover. From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. And John founded Search for Common Ground, which is an NGO. And if you don't know what that means, it's a nonprofit or non-governmental organization. But the company's name is often shortened to just being Search. Search for Common Ground is just Search. How great is that? That's so cool. One of the stories in this book ends with a really, really powerful statement. The dynamic was already there. Search brought the flame. Today, we're going to hear John Marks bring us a little bit of the flame. So, hello, John, and thank you for joining me.
Well, the pleasure is mine. Thank you, Lynn.
I was just absolutely thrilled to get to have this conversation with you and appreciate all the juggling to make this happen. So I know you're busy.
Indeed. I'm on a 10-city tour for the book, and I've been going to universities. I've been doing podcasts. I'm trying to get people to read the book.
Well, I read the book, and I hope this podcast gets a few more people to read the book. And I've actually I didn't even tell you this in advance, I've actually bought a couple of copies and sent them to people who are really thinking about doing some social entrepreneurship type things. And I'm like, hey, here's the blueprints. Here's somebody to get it.
That's wonderful.
Good. I'm not even making that up. It's truly the truth. So I just said social entrepreneurship. Let's talk about, what does that mean? What is it?
Well, to be a social entrepreneur is to be a person who starts a new or expands greatly an existing enterprise, and is a person who is adept at building and constructing new ways of doing things and the like. And my field was peace building or extended mediation, but the methodology I used to build an organization, and my organization went from 0 people to 600 people over the time I was the head of it. The methodology that I used, along with my wife, who was my partner in this work, was the methodology of social entrepreneurship. So that methodology can be used to build a law firm, to to build an environmental group. I mean, it can be used for virtually any area. I happen to do it in the area of peace building. So the examples that I use in the book come from my own experience in peace building.
And those experiences are so varied. You've been on, can you fairly say you've done every continent on the globe at this point?
Well, I haven't been to Antarctica yet.
I was wondering. That was the one I thought maybe you had been to, but I didn't know you might have vacationed there. I don't ever claim to everything.
No, but I've been to all the others.
Right. And so with your peace building in mind, in your social entrepreneurship as an engineering platform to get there, how were you able to step away? Because, well, you and I were visiting a minute ago, and you are no longer with Search for Common Ground, or Search for short. You stepped away in 2014. And I believe, I mean, I don't know how long you spent, but I believe you spent the last so many years looking back and working on this book. Is that correct?
Well, I haven't worked on the book all that time. I spent a couple of years doing the book, but I could keep engaged. I stepped down at the age of 71, so I figured that at a certain point my board would come for me, or I would be hit by a bus or some variation thereof. So I figured it was time. I also wanted to name my successor, and that was important to me. And I figured that if I were hit by a bus or had to leave abruptly, I would lose that ability. And I was very clear I didn't want my successor to come from outside the organization. I wanted to preserve our culture as an organization. And I was pretty sure my board would have screwed it up if it had been left to them. So by leaving early, Susan and I, my wife Susan and I, were able to name our successor.
So tell me, when you look backwards, you just talked about this great opportunity. This was an accomplishment for you. What is your biggest regret when you look backwards? And then what's your biggest accomplishment from search?
There's quite a bit of failure involved in this kind of work. I mean, my biggest regret probably is not having been able to make peace in the Middle East, which I worked on for 25 years, but which seemed to have gotten worse in the interim. And I'd say our biggest success, or the one I'm most proud of, is the work that we did between the United States and Iran. As an organization, we put together about 7 or 8 years ago a group of Iranian and American physicists who worked out the problems of how to have an agreement, a nuclear agreement between the two countries. We called it technical mediation. The idea was for them to see where the obstacles would be and in advance to show how they could be resolved. And this is 5 years before the official negotiators came together. And these guys, these physicists, wrote 70-page papers, which I, as the president of the organization, couldn't understand a word of. But they were very technical on how to deal with heavy water reactors, how to deal with the various technical questions. And by showing both sides that it was possible to have a solution to the problems that was within the scope of what both sides felt was acceptable, that made a big difference. We gave the papers to both the Americans and the Iranian sides. The Americans didn't pay a lot of attention, but the Iranians paid a lot of attention to it. And the foreign minister of Iran, Zarif, said afterwards there wouldn't have been an agreement without us. Now, of course, that agreement came about, and then President Trump, during his regime, canceled the whole thing. But the fact of having gotten us to that point was, to me, an incredible accomplishment.
There haven't been a lot of open hands in that area.
No. From the point of view of doing a mediation, it perhaps a unique one to have accomplished. And we had to bring together people who had expertise in both nuclear physics and also who were willing to sit down and talk to the other side. And it worked. And I had a retired ambassador running that program named Bill Miller, who was an arms control specialist and a very good mediator, and it worked.
Well, you love it when a plan comes together, even when you didn't build the whole plan at once. There's so many things we're going to talk about in a minute about have a plan and hold it loosely. It's going to be okay. So Vision to Action is not your first book, correct?
No, that's right. I've written 2 before. The first one was a bestseller about 50 years ago.
Oh, just yesterday.
Yeah. It was called The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence. And I have the dubious honor of having been the co-author of the first book in American history to be censored before publication, because my co-author was somebody who had been a part of the CIA and had signed an oath that he wouldn't reveal anything. And the government went to court and got an injunction against him before publication. And then my second book was called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and it won a major award. It told the story about how the CIA had tried to use the behavioral sciences. Specifically, there were 3 chapters about LSD and one about mushrooms in there. And they were all method techniques which the CIA had experimented with. And that book, for me, was an eye-opener, because it opened me up to the idea that human behavior could be changed by exterior means. And I didn't want to do it like the CIA did it, in terms of strapping people down and, sort of using coercive method. But what I saw, that I wanted it to be like more of a psychiatrist or psychologist who could change behavior on a mass scale. And that was the intellectual transition for me from what one commentator on PBS called from provocateur to peacemaker.
And I think you see yourself as a peacemaker, or do you see yourself as a provocateur?
No, I see myself as a peacemaker. I mean, I've been doing this kind of work for 40 years. So that original work, which was based on being an advocate and acting in an adversarial manner, is over for me. I still can get angry, but it's not something that's driving me at this point. I'm very much a peacemaker. And, let's just say I've changed, but it took the world quite a long time to accept that I had changed.
Sure, you can make the changes, but to sell the changes sometimes is a little bit harder. You've got to keep at it, right?
Exactly. In one of my last years before I made that transition, I had about 6 or 7 op-ed articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And after I made the transition, they wouldn't take my stuff.
Well, I think you're doing okay. You're still okay. You're still okay without it.
I'm not complaining.
Okay, but this book now, why write this book now? What is the point for you with this book?
I learned a lot in my career as a peacemaker. And I wanted to make sure that the methodology I developed, the principles I came up with, lived. I wanted to pass it on to the next generation. And a legacy is very important to me. Now, of course, I have a legacy in having left behind the largest peace-building organization in the world. So that goes on. But, it's that organization, like all evolving organizations, has changed. And I wanted to make sure that the stuff that I had directly learned persists and stays alive and can be picked up by others. And that doesn't happen automatically.
No, wonderful. Wonderfully said. I have to say, when I read this, I'm fairly entrepreneurial myself. I have this going. I have my own firm. I have 2 or 3 other projects going. And I really felt like so many things that you listed as things to remember along the way, these operational foundational pieces, apply to anyone working on a company, to apply to all these sort of things, and not just for this one way of social entrepreneurship. That was how you did it. But I think it can work in a brick and mortar mindset just as well.
No, I completely agree with that. I just don't know enough about those other fields to make that application. But one of my hopes with the book is that others will.
Yes.
And most of it is common sense, actually.
But John, you know what they say about common sense.
What do they say?
It's not that common.
Right. I do say that one of my principles is better known to 5-year-old children than it is to make yesable propositions. When you make a proposition to someone, you want them to say, yes, of course. But most people don't think about what the other person would want. They think only about what they want. And I say in the book that 5-year-old children probably are more adept at this than us adults.
It's true. I did, as I'm a mother of 4, and I giggled through that. I really did. I thought, yes, this is true. We what is it they told you everything you really needed to know you learned in kindergarten, but we lost some of it along the way.
It's true.
So your book contains 11 working principles. Will you read these? Because there are a few foreign languages in. Let me just remind everybody that John has lived in multiple countries. And I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I'm going to put you on the spot and say, how many languages are you functional in?
Just French and English.
Oh, just French and English. I would say some people would listen to my English and say it wasn't even English. I really do adore the times when I have been in Amsterdam and someone will say, oh, no, I only speak 4 languages. And they're ashamed. And I'm always, that would be 3.5 more than I speak, probably. So it's so wonderful to have more than one language. But would you walk through these 11 working principles for me?
I would, but I have to get a copy of the book to do it.
Then I'll help you because you something I can't say, and we'll do it together. How about that?
That's better.
Okay, we'll do this together.
Yeah.
Look, this is how it works. You help each other out, right? Guessable proposition right there. Well,
done.
thanks, sir. Thank you. I'm always a lifelong learner. Number one, start from vision. Number two, be an applied.
I can do them from the first three.
Okay, you get to do the third one because we both know I can't say it.
Yeah.
What is the third?
The third one is on s'engage, oui envoie, which is French, which means one becomes engaged and then one sees what the possibilities are. And it's very important when you're in the middle of a mediation or a workshop or a project to realize that you need to adjust because of what's come before. And not everyone does that if they have a strict lesson plan or they've been planning it out or whatever. The Soviets had learned that with their 5-year plans, that kind of long-term planning does not get to all the steps that one needs to be taken. And having that flexibility is a key part of being a mediator, or being a social entrepreneur, or pretty much doing anything in life. Unfortunately, there are an awful lot of people, particularly bureaucrats, who don't like that one too much.
And yet I thought, I can't say it, but I will keep writing it to myself because I thought it was such a wonderful moment to say. It's almost that reminder of how important it is to recognize the need, recognize that, to hold this and keep moving this forward. So say it for me one more time.
On s'engage, oui envoie. But the reason I use it in French is it's something that Napoleon said. And Napoleon was talking in a military sense. He was talking about if you really want to see what the defenses of an enemy are, you need to attack and see what's there. And that notion of being willing to push forward in order to see what the opportunities and the possibilities are is what I was getting at. So anyway, I'm using a French phrase, which I translate in the book. The book is certainly not in French.
No, it's not. I promise. There are a few more languages, but we have one more with just a little bit more to go. Okay. So number 4, keep showing up. You really don't think you'd have to say that, but keep showing up. And it's so true over and over and over again. People have great ideas and they have so much motivation at the beginning and the keep showing up part. It was very powerful.
Yeah.
Number 5, enroll credible supporters. Wouldn't think you have to say that, but you do. Expect the Dunbar factor. We'll circle back to that one. Make yesable propositions. We're back to the 5-year-old. So good. Practice Aikido. That one I actually did know how to say, because I was familiar with the practice, but I'm excited. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Develop effective metaphors. We're on 9, if you're counting, and 10, display chutzpah. Now 11 is magical. And I will ask you also to tell us, what is that final number 11 and how does that translate as well?
It's display Fingerspitzengefühl. That's a German word that means you're having an intuitive touch at the tip of your fingers. And what I'm saying is it's very important to have a sense of where you're going, of where you've been, this project, not that project, this way forward, not that way forward. But I also say it shouldn't be 100% relied upon. You need to mix your cognition, your intellectual ability with your instincts. And to find the right mix, of course, is not so easy. And I know you can't go and get a PhD in Fingerspitzengefühl. It doesn't happen.
Would be kind of fun if you could. Yes. Go and figure out how to do that formula. We'd probably be doing something else with our lives if we could figure all of that out. Maybe not you, maybe just me. So I very, very firmly believe that need drives change. You've got to understand the need to push the change. New facts lead to new directions. To get to change, we all have to go through some form of conflict. The show is called Let's Talk About Conflict. So conflict, in my mind, is always at the heart of change. So for you personally, are you afraid of change?
No, I might be something of a conflict avoider. I mean, who is in this field? It tends to attract people who like to avoid conflict or make it disappear. But no, I think the change is very important, and I recognize that conflict is inevitable, and that it's the tension that arises from conflict out of which comes meaningful change.
Conflict is inevitable. How we process it, how we work our way through it, and what we look for on the other side of it, I think is the difference. That's what my approach is.
That's right. In my field, what we're trying to do is avoid violence. In other words, and conflict can lead to violence, but if it's resolved or it's diffused, violence can be avoided. Now, in the United States, we don't have as much of a problem with violence, except there's violence adversarial behavior, which characterizes a lot of our political debate today. So it's nonviolent violence, in a sense. We don't have too much or a lot of actual violence, political violence in this country, but there's certainly a polarized country out there, and not, would I say, nonviolent violence.
Which is a scary term. Well, it's scary to me. I think you're accurate. I wouldn't push you on it. So how did you develop your vision for starting Search for Common Ground?
Well, as I mentioned to you before, I was an advocate. I was very anti-war during the Vietnam War. I took on the abuses of the CIA and the other intelligence, and I got to the point in my own life where I felt my professional work was being determined by what I was against. And I realized I wanted to be for things rather than against. And rather than tear down the old system, I wanted to be able to build a new system. And that little transition, which I'm talking to you rather glibly about, took me about 3 or 4 years with a messy divorce in the middle of it just to keep things percolated. But when I did make that transition, I had to make it. I could not, even though I have my preference in every conflict I've ever been involved in, I usually see one side is more right and one side is more wrong, but I can't say it. In other words, if you want to be a peacemaker, you have to avoid getting involved on one side or the other. That's a perfectly honorable profession to be an advocate for one side or the other, but it's not peacemaking.
Peacemaking always stays in the middle.
That's right. Or you can't be, everyone can't be neutral. Most people can't be neutral. But what you can do is keep your mouth shut.
Oh, we've talked a lot about silence on this program, so I'm so excited you just said that. Oh, there's power in silence, everyone. So much power in silence. Okay, so once the vision is established, you recommend being an applied visionary. How does one become an applied visionary?
Well, to be a pure visionary is useful if you're going to start a new religion or you're going to try to write a philosophy textbook. But it's not particularly useful in making actual things happen in the world. You want to be able to apply your vision in concrete, finite steps in order to make things happen. And that means going A, B, C, M, N, O, P. It might not be a straight line, but you need to be able to do things that go forward one step at a time. I use a phrase in the book called be a salami slicer. In other words, slice off achievable, doable pieces from whatever the problem is. And that's a good way to start. And once you do that, sometimes the whole conflict will open up. But in the beginning, if you go for a grand unified solution, you're probably going to wind up with nothing.
I absolutely thought salami slice was such a fascinating way to think about this. I think we've all stood, well, I shouldn't say that. I have definitely stood at a deli counter and watched the salami slicer. So you start from a large unit. We all want the whole, but if you can't see it in the smaller pieces, we're going to have a hard time finding the whole. It's just a wonderful phrase, salami slicing. Okay, we're back to our lovely French phrase in chapter 3. You can say it for me one more time.
When on s'engage, puis on voit. One becomes engaged and one sees what the possibilities are. And I would note, when you make a proposal, to a funder. You can't say, well, I'm going to get involved and get engaged and good things will happen. You can count on me. You have to be more finite than that. So, but you need also to be able to make changes while you're in the middle of this. And you have to find the mix, as in all things, the right mix.
And you've had moments where it was better than others. So how do you encourage people to start their visions without sticking too tightly to that predetermined plan?
Well, I think a vision can be constant. In other words, I've held on to my present vision for over 40 years. Though visions are not immutable, because I had lots of vision before that, which I didn't pursue for any length of time. I started out as a young diplomat. My vision was to be an ambassador, and I lost that one along the way. But you need to be able to have a vision, and then everything that you do should be consistent with that vision, or at least not inconsistent.
So if you have this consistent vision and you create an overly excessive amount of planning, which is starting to cause barriers to moving forward, how do you know? What is a good test if you put so many parameters on this thing that it's not moving?
If the world accepts what you're doing, and there are lots of ways that acceptance can be measured, by resources becoming available, by people joining with you and the like. That's about the only test. And if you can make things happen, if you can't make things happen, you probably should choose another profession.
Wonderful. I really want to talk I don't want to leave this. There was so much great things in the chapter I can't pronounce. But you really talked about social entrepreneurs needing to be deeply engaged with their vision. As you just said, 40 years, you've consistently, deeply been engaged with your vision, because if you're not, you may miss opportunities. And for me, that feels like those internal conflicts that I've talked about on this show before. How do you manage the internal conflict of holding the vision and yet being open enough to see opportunity?
Well, the vision is the baseline. It's where you come from in doing your work. Finding ways to implement it. There are infinite numbers of ways to implement it. And my little secret was to form an organization in which people would take over a new project once it got started. Because it's irresponsible to start things and then drop them, it seems to me. But we were successful enough that we were able to raise money and find resources to open up new programs, to the point we were operating in 35 countries. And that came out of the entrepreneurial spirit of being able to create new enterprises. But the organization's been going on now for 40 years and is still growing. So there was something that it continued to come from that vision, though lots of people came in and out, and we didn't have a test to make sure our employees were operating in a way that was consistent with the vision, but they had to really, and they usually did, or they wouldn't stay with us.
Well, that makes sense. I think that proves out in the end almost every time. If the culture and the vision isn't shared, then people will find somewhere else to be. So you just talked about you have to keep showing up. And in this chapter, the name Keep Showing Up, you discuss trust, but verify. So how like that phrase helps you in conflict?
When you're dealing with people who to you are a little shaky, and that chapter was written about the work I did between the U.S. and Iran. And I went into that work with a certain degree of what you might call prejudice or bias against some of the things that had happened from the Iranian side. The seizure of the American embassy in 1979, still very much in my mind.
Sure.
And so when a former Iranian ambassador came to me and said, let's start an informal group to see if we can find ways to have better relations, I was a little skeptical that maybe he wasn't sincere. His father was an Ayatollah. And now I thought Ayatollahs were people who screamed death to America and the like. And it took me about a year to be sure that this was a guy I could trust enough to work with. But I verified at the same time. Saw evidence. I wanted to make sure I wasn't being taken to the cleaners, and I wasn't. And it worked out very well. As I said to you before, we did some incredible work between the United States and Iran. And that came out of that original relationship.
Trust, but verify. Do your homework.
Yeah.
Sure. Later in the chapter 4, you discuss making maximum use of connections, no matter how distant. I think a lot of times people, out of sight, out of mind, people forget that there are connections that are maybe not at your immediate fingertips, but not far apart. So what are some great practices for how to recognize and connect the dots of connection?
Okay. I want to add to what I just said. The trust but verify phrase came from Ronald Reagan. He was talking about what he was doing with the Soviets and Gorbachev, and he said, "We can trust them, but we have to verify that the trust is authentic." Now, to get to the connections part, it's when you find people who you can work with, who have, let's say, some prestige in the world, that can enhance your own work. So it's probably is not a necessary component of being successful to have a very impressive advisory board or group of supporters, but it certainly helps. Mm-hmm. And it helps a lot in the beginning when you're not known because you haven't done very much to be known. And if you have so-and-so who is a big wheel on your stationery as an advisor of counsel in your field, it certainly doesn't hurt your business.
It's never going to hurt you. That's what I'm hearing you say.
But a warning here is that you don't want people who are so grasping or who they want to take over your work. I had a friend who said, you don't want anyone on your board who doesn't have enough to do.
Isn't that the truth? That's kind of the truth in general, isn't it? You need to be busy. People tend to draw busy people. And safer that way. It's what I heard you say in your book.
Yeah.
A little safer that way. So credibility, it is so, what you were just talking about is these credible supporters and that are really going to help you in how do you disengage if you try to work with a credible supporter that maybe isn't helping you?
Well, you cut your losses and you disengage if you're getting in trouble. You don't want to jeopardize your work. It's not that important. It's not indispensable to have such people. And if they are doing things you don't want or trying to push you in the wrong direction, cut your losses. And you hope that they're not so powerful that they're going to crush you for doing that. And in the world I live in, people don't always operate that way, but some do.
Well, I'm an attorney, and I would agree with that statement. You just have to agree with that statement. That's entertainment for some people in the world. I'm not mine, but I definitely want to play out.
Right. Yeah, I would draw a distinction, too, between a board and an advisory board. In other words, a board probably, at least in the beginning years, should be kept very small with people who the entrepreneur trusts and who will work with them. And they can bring in the kind of the big cheeses on the advisory board, which has no actual power, but in which they're essentially lending you their name and maybe making a few phone calls for you or a few connections and the like. And that's ideal. It's not always possible to maintain it that way, but you want to be careful with that, with bringing in credible supporters. That's all.
Absolutely. So now you have expect the Dunbar factor. It is the unknown unknowns. And you recommend keeping yourself agile enough to minimize the damage and make the most out of unforeseeable events. Isn't that life in a nutshell? Unforeseeable events. So who is Dunbar?
Dunbar was a dog, a seeing eye dog. And what happened is at one point, I was hiring for the first time ever in the history of the organization, a blind guy who had a service dog named Dunbar. And I asked all the questions when I thought that one needed to ask about could Peter, Dunbar's master, use a computer? What about with the telephone? Would Dunbar foul the office if Peter was late for a meeting? Those kinds of questions. And I thought I'd ask all the questions. But there was one that I forgot to. I didn't realize that it was a question, so I didn't ask it. And that's what I call the Dunbar factor. The question was anybody in the office allergic to dogs? The answer was yes. And that person was my assistant, who I didn't want to lose because we had hired a guy with a service dog. And so we did it, but I didn't think to ask the question because I'm a dog lover and I've always grown up with dogs, owned beagles, these kinds of things. So it just didn't occur to me. It would occur to me now. I'm smart enough to know the second time. So we found a workaround. We put Dunbar and Peter as far away from my office as possible. And our protocol for meetings was if people from the office had a meeting with me, they'd come to my office because I was the president. And in the case of Dunbar and Peter, I would go to his office because I wanted to keep Dunbar away from my assistant. And that was the workaround. And what I'm saying in the book is there's nothing you can do to prevent unexpected events. Maybe you might have planned in advance if you had thought that this was going to be a problem, but who knew it was going to be a problem? So it was an unknown. And that I call the Dunbar factor. And you need to be able to come up with workarounds. I'm not sure which that word is, the plural. But, and not be floored, not be overwhelmed by unexpected events, because they're going to happen in almost anything you do. When you intervene in a complex situation, you're going to get complex responses.
Absolutely. I just thought that was so lovely, that the way you said the unknown unknowns, which is just part of it. You really can. We love the phrase seeing around corners. You cannot see around a corner. That's why the phrase exists. You're going to try, but you really don't know what's on the other side until you get there. And so working around and figuring out how to get through, that is just so wonderfully. So chapter 7, honestly, you're not supposed to do this, but it was probably my favorite. I'll be honest. It was really, really my favorite because you talk about make yesable proposition. And I already incorporated this phrase into my negotiation class and focusing on, what do you need from the other party and how do you place that into a yesable proposition? I'm in the middle of reading Bill Urey's book about the positive no and the yesable. These things are all connected. And what makes something a yesable proposition?
A yesable proposition is a proposition to which the other side says yes, and which is in the interest of the person who makes the proposition. It's a win-win proposition as opposed to a win-lose proposition. And actually, Bill Urey and Roger Fisher popularized the phrase in their book, Getting to Yes. I believe Roger himself, who I used to work for way back when, originated the phrase.
So part of what you discussed in the book is making a yesable proposition, but not pandering. How do you separate those two?
If you make a proposition which is only in the interest of the other party, I see that as pandering. In other words, if you do something because they want to give you money and it's not something you want to do, that's just pandering or being selfish or whatever. And you want to avoid that too. You want to work in ways that are consistent with your vision. Now, but at the same time, to make yesable propositions, you need to see what they want and what you want, and to find presumably the maximum point of convergence. And that's the win-win point. Now, it's not always so easy to do, but it's certainly a good idea.
Yeah, it's the goal. if you can have a goal in it, it would definitely be the goal. So you end chapter 7, which I've already admitted was my favorite. You end it with this statement, which I found so powerful. I want to quote you. A societal approach to conflict prevention, remember we're talking about conflict in this show always, could work well in a geographically large country. In this case, we're talking about the DRC, and that even a place as lawless as the DRC, this large, potentially a lawless scene place, skillfully crafted yesable positions can result in positive social change. It was just such a great quote. I don't want to steal everything from your book for the listeners, but it was just such a wonderful thing to think about. So what are ways we can always work towards those yesable propositions and that positive social change?
Well, you do it. If you stay consistent to your values, I mean, it could be that you're only working on what you would call a back fence negotiation between two parties arguing about the back fence. But that also can be consistent. And you certainly can. It's much easier, actually, to make yesable propositions when the conflict is small and when the number of parties is 2. Sure. That's ideally. But most conflicts on the international level, which I was working in, involve millions of people. And I think that the ability to resolve the conflict varies inversely with the number of people engaged.
Perfect. Helpful. So helpful. Okay, we're shifting into the next chapter. We're leaving my favorite chapter, but we're shifting into this. It's all an excellent book. Don't take me the wrong way. But what is Aikido? And why is it important?
Aikido is a Japanese martial art. And first, I'll tell you what it's not. In boxing, if an opponent comes at you, you try to knock that person backwards by 180 degrees and knock them on their rear end. And that's the essence of boxing. In Aikido, if an attacker comes at you, you accept their energy and you try to divert it by 10 degrees or 20 degrees and find a possibility that makes both of you safe. And if you try to, as a conflict resolver, or actually as a human being, to go for the grand unified solution for the overall, by confronting, it isn't going to work. And the way I find that's most effective to resolve conflict is to understand the differences between people and act on the commonalities. In other words, to be a salami slicer, as we talked about before, who's able to find a part of the conflict that can be resolved because it's in the interest of both parties. And usually there are more than 2 parties, but in any case, that in the interest of the parties. And to find a solution to that, which can open up the possibility of much more happening anyway.
And another great quote from the book, the best time to prevent conflict is before it reaches crisis proportion. There are lots of little crises, I shouldn't use the word crises, lots of smaller conflicts that can be addressed, that can be managed. But once you reach a critical tipping point, it's much harder to pull this thing back from the edge.
Yes. Well put. I agree 100% with the way you just phrased it. And one of the difficulties in the international realm is, as a country, we, the United States, tend to deal with conflict after it becomes violent, after it has reached the crisis point of view. And the time it's preventable or more preventable is before. And we've never taken that on as a country as an operating policy. I mean, everybody in the State Department would probably say, oh, that's true. But let's say they want to deal with the crisis that's already existing rather than the one that hasn't happened yet, but is giving signs of starting to happen.
The reaction versus the proaction, waiting for the reaction. It's always harder to be, the best, I hate to do it, but the offense is always better than a defense. You really want to stay in the offense. You want to move down the field. Offense is generally where you want to be in life and in football. So it's the fall in the South. I can't help it. So you had a great story about Morocco, and that Search brought in mediation training for youth leaders, very specifically mediation and very specifically youth. So why both of those things?
We were trying to introduce mediation in its modern form to Morocco. That was a big part of what we were trying to do. They had traditional mediators, but modernity had swept that away. That's one of the problems with modern life. It tends to get rid of even the good parts of olden times. And we wanted to create a culture of mediation in the country. And young people were a very important place to start. We also there did massive trainings for lawyers who conversely don't usually like mediation because it cuts into billings. And we did mediation training in a country that didn't exist. And we worked with the Ministry of Justice. We had an agreement with them to do this because they saw that their judicial system was clogged up and wasn't working too well. And in the end, the Parliament of Morocco passed a law making mediation legal. And in a country with a Napoleonic code, if something is not legal, it's illegal. It's a little different than here. And we were able to bring mediation to Morocco and have been credited with having done so. And we worked in prisons, we worked with religious leaders and the like. And we were able to, in essence, inject a new element into the culture. And now there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who make their livelihood as mediators, which is something I'm very proud of. And people said to us, why are you working in Morocco? There's no violence in Morocco. And the answer was, if something wasn't done to find a better way to solve problems, there probably would be violence.
So that would be offense and not defense.
Yes.
Once again. So chapter 9, you really encourage visionaries to develop effective metaphors. And all throughout your book, you use different metaphors from different times and different groups you were working with from Search. I do want you to tell the audience your metaphor about the lit match, because that is so powerful to me. And again, I think it drives the point home of why metaphors are so important. Please let me stop talking and you tell that metaphor and any others that you found in the value.
If people don't get an accurate picture of where they're going, of where change could take place, they're probably not going to go there. So during the Cold War, when the U.S. and Soviets were at each other's throats, we developed a metaphor and expanded something I think I had heard somewhere else, that the Cold War was like two little boys standing knee deep in a room full of gasoline. One held 10 matches and one held 7 matches. And a lot of the argument was about who had the most matches or how do we get more matches than the other side and the like. And the problem and the way to deal with that was called arms control, by shifting the mix of matches. I said, that probably wasn't the best way to proceed. The problem was they were standing in a room full of gasoline and one match could set off the whole business and explode it. And what we were trying to do as an organization was to find ways to drain the gasoline from the room. And that metaphor let's just say, got the organization through the first 3 or 4 years. I used to stand up in living rooms and talk about that in the context of our work. It was my Tupperware approach to fundraising. And people could get that metaphor. And it worked. And we expanded it in later years to come up with something called Common Ground Productions, which is a way to make television and radio programming in about 25 countries around the world. And our most effective was dramatic TV. Well, I used to call it soap opera for social change. And we made hundreds of episodes all over the world to try to have people see new ways, different ways of looking at problems that might cause violence.
Okay, so we were just talking about seeing it, and I think sometimes metaphors are help people see things in their mind's eye, right? It's fairly, as you just described, those were truly moving pictures people were seeing, but when you talk about a metaphor, people see the picture in their mind. It's kind of like when you tell your kids you'll take them to the movie, but they have to read the book first. And they come out of the movies and say, the book was better. And you say, the book is always better. But that's the point. You've got to get these visions in your mind that matter to you. They connect with you. That's the beauty of a metaphor.
That's right. And you also need to be able to do it in visual terms or oral terms or whatever. It's not just in the written word. And so many supposed change makers write monographs or books. And I happen to talk to his author of a book. And it's probably not the best way to get across information and the like.
Yes, but you're an author of a book who just talked about their Tupperware pitch. And so for my younger members of the audience, you don't understand what that means. But what it meant was, they used to sell Tupperware by going and having a Tupperware party in somebody's house, and everybody would come together and hear this pitch at once. And they would do it in small communal elements. So for my younger audience, that is a Tupperware pitch. For those of us my age, we understood exactly what you meant, and I appreciate it very much. There's another line. We're talking about the visual and the audio, but this as I wouldn't say I'm in the peace building business. Let me say that. That's easy for me to say. But I do feel like I am in the deep conflict communication business. And this quote in your book, and I actually have written it in a couple of places to remind myself, when people do not listen, there is little chance for them to find common ground. And I talk so much about the differences in hearing and listening and active listening. And so why do you take time in your book to point out the need for listening?
Because listening is probably the single most important part of being a person who can deal with conflict. Most people are much more interested in talking than they are in listening. And if you don't hear them out, it probably is not, you're probably not going to be able to do anything to resolve the problems. I found I produced a series of documentaries in Israel and Palestine about how to resolve the conflict. And I found in every interview I was doing, the person had a real need to make an opening statement. So if I asked, what's your name? It was probably likely I was going to get a 15-minute response. And rather than interrupt it and try to get them on subject, I let that happen because that was kind of the price of admission. And hopefully we wouldn't burn up too much film with that kind of thing. But it was important. And if you interrupt that need to express who the person is or where they're coming from or what their views are, you're not going to get very far with them. And once you've exhausted that, you could sometimes get things moving forward.
Absolutely. I always talk about that silence is one of the most powerful tools you have. And in your silence, you really should be practicing active listening. Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's a skill, something you have to work at. Don't think about your laundry list. Don't think about the other thing. Focus on what you're hearing. So your 10th working principle is display chutzpah. Great word. Everyone loves the word. Why is it so important?
To be a social entrepreneur, to make things happen, you probably need to be able to take risks. And that means you need to be able to push forward. You need to have audacity. The metaphor I like is of the child's toy truck, the one that you wind up and it moves forward till it hits a piece of furniture and then it backs off and finds another way around. But it keeps moving forward. And that quality of audacity or nerve or chutzpah is something that is very important if you're going to make things happen in the world. You don't want to be obnoxious. You want to be politely pushy.
I like that. Politely pushy. I think some of the people I've had might say I was trying to be politely pushy, but maybe I just was pushy.
There's a tendency to go over the line on that.
Because you can see where you just want so much to get them there. Why should you trust the process? It's such a common phrase in mediation. Trust the process, touch the process. People feel so, I think, I try so hard in mediation, especially conflict work, to explain as much of the process as you can so that they have some ownership into it and don't feel lost. But why should we trust the process?
Usually, you don't have a choice. Yes, you can make adjustments, you can make changes, but in the middle of the workshop, you can't call it off.
Right.
I can't tell you, particularly in the early years, how I used to think that, the first day of workshops we were sponsoring, how the organization was going up in flames and how this was probably the last gasp. And usually it would be okay by the end. And so trusting the process is good for your own stomach. And in other words, it's good so you don't kind of go over the deep end and the like. And I'm not saying you can't make adjustments and you can't make changes, but in essence, when you have something moving forward, you're probably going to have to trust it's going to work until you have time to change it and work it in a responsible way.
You have to start somewhere. You really have to have a somewhere start. So to build that gut, if you will, that you can then trust your gut, how did you build yours?
Well, Aikido was part of it. When I was in the middle of a conflict, I would divert it. I would not take the energy. I mean, there was always a tendency to go, stop. But that didn't work very well. I saw it.
Here.
Yeah. And you would sort of be crushed by that. None of us really have the power to make things stop as much as we would like to. I mean, it would be wonderful if I could stop the Middle East crisis, but I can't. And I recognize that. And that was my secret, my trick. Now, other people have their own ways of doing these things, but by avoiding directly confronting it, I avoided, for the most part, burnout. And I've been doing this work for over 40 years and really haven't burned out yet. Maybe that'll come.
No, I think your passion is not planning to leave. You are still the lit match, I think. You're still burning with a whole lot of desire to see a better world for everyone in it. At the end of the book, you talk about cultivating this magic journey.
It's a really good fuel.
Yes, which is easy for you to say. As the owner of this small podcast, as a mediator, this hit home for me. You say that your books, and you described it earlier, but I'm just going to repeat this, that it translates to mean feeling through your fingertips or knowing without thinking. Someone might even say, how is this even possible? I mean, how do you do that? I think a lot of times you learn this phrase in law school about, did it smell right? And I have said that so many times to people where it's like, this doesn't smell right. And you just pause because it doesn't feel right. It doesn't smell right. You can just get a sense about it sometimes, but you couldn't 100% put your finger on why. Tell me, in your experiences, the times where you were so grateful for the ability to cultivate that experience.
I'm not sure you can find a way to make yourself better or cultivating it. But what you can have is a sense of where you are. Bill Bradley, the former professional basketball player and U.S. Senator, wrote a book. He was quoted in a book saying, once you played basketball for a while, you can chew you know where all the players are. You can chew without looking. And he said, you have a sense of where you are. And that sense is there. Now, he clearly had it better than most people. And I don't think you can teach this. It's something you have to have a feel for. But some people do and some people don't. And as I said before, it needs to be combined. You don't want to be totally going on your gut. You also want your intellectual processes, and you want to be able to find the correct mix between your intellectual process and your gut reactions. But being able to have both is a very important quality.
No, it was so beautifully said. So beautifully said. So we started this podcast with you kind of describing that your life's work has been Search for Common Ground. And yet in 2014, you handed this off to someone else that you picked in the organization, and you felt like you left it in good hands. And in this word retire, which you haven't, you've just shifted, which we can talk about that too. But you're not retired, you're shifting. You have a really wonderful quote. This is the prospect, once I fully comprehended it, did not make me feel warm and fuzzy. I love this. It's a very short sentence that summed up a whole lot of very, very, very big feelings. And thank you for that. Thank you for that honesty. I think sometimes people are like, oh, no, it was fine. No, that's hard. It's very hard to walk away from the thing you've worked so hard to grow and build. And yet, as we began the show, you were talking about the understanding the importance of shifting your role away from there, knowing it was in the hands that were right for your organization. So what are your feelings on all of that today?
I probably suffered from what we might call postpartum depression. In other words, this was my baby. With my wife, I had built it into a very substantial organization. And at this point, I gave it up. And I not only gave it up, but I was more separated from it than I wanted to be. And so I didn't like that particularly. And one reason I wrote this book was I wanted that a legacy to be left behind in addition to the organization. The organization has done very well. My successor's done very well. But the process of being head of an organization that's doing good work in the world and then suddenly going cold turkey is not the most enlivening thing that ever happened to me, let's just say.
And yet you speak about it and you write about it with so much positivity and I think almost security in a way of leaving something better than you started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's both. It's, I think that, I'm 81 years old at this point, and at this age, I probably shouldn't be running an organization like this. It was something I needed to do, but did I like the process? No, not particularly.
I would think, odd things if you did. So I thought your one beautiful sentence said a whole lot. And so thank you for, confirming that. Thank you for being with me today. I know that you are bouncing around on multiple time zones and accomplishing so many things right now. From vision to action, once again, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, because I listen to podcasts, but you younger folks still like to watch it. The cover I'm holding up, you can see this wonderful, wonderful book, From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. The author, John Marks, has been my guest here today. Thank you so much for visiting with me and talking about your work. Before we started recording, I said, this is so far afield from the conflict work I do, but as we talk about the details, it's not really that far apart, is it?
Well, thank you, Lynn, and thank you for having such an inspiring interview with me.
Well, my pleasure. So for those of you, it's your first time visiting us, come back and visit us again. We talk about skills in conflict, This is the teaching podcast, not meant to be any legal advice. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you down the road.